The town labeled the boy a thief, until a native warrior stood between them. The word thief followed the boy through the street like something alive, passed from mouth to mouth until it no longer needed a voice, and he felt it stick to his back as he walked, shoulders hunched, eyes on the dirt, because once a town decided what you were, it expected you to stay that way. He had taken nothing more than a bruised apple from a crate left unattended near the mercantile door, his fingers closing around it before hunger could be argued with, and he had meant to eat it and be gone. But a shout had cut through the morning, and suddenly men were pointing, women were pulling children aside, and the word was spoken loud enough to make it true. The boy stood in the middle of the street now, the apple dropped and crushed under a boot, hands shaking at his sides, while the crowd tightened into a half circle that smelled of dust and judgment, and he knew that running would only make them surer, because running always did. Someone said he'd been stealing for weeks. Someone else said boys like him always did. And the boy wondered when exactly he had become a kind instead of a person, because he could not remember choosing it. The sheriff had not arrived yet, but the town did not wait for law when it had fear to guide it, and a farmer grabbed the boy's collar hard enough to lift him onto his toes, demanding where else he had hidden stolen goods. And the boy tried to speak, to explain the apple, the empty nights, the way his stomach hurt so bad it made him dizzy, but the words tangled in his throat and came out as nothing. Laughter broke out at that, sharp and mean, because silence was taken as guilt, and the boy felt the familiar heat of shame crawl up his neck, the same heat he had felt in other towns, other streets, other moments when adults decided he was easier to blame than to help. A rope appeared in someone's hand, not tied yet, just present, and the sight of it made the boy's chest tighten because he had seen ropes used before in ways no child should remember, and he took a step back, bumping into someone who shoved him forward again, telling him to stand still like a man if he was going to be punished like one. That was when the Lakota warrior stepped out of the trading post doorway, tall and unmoving, wrapped in a dark blanket despite the sun, his eyes steady as they swept the scene, taking in the rope, the boy's crushed apple, the way the crowd leaned inward like a single body hungry for an ending. He said nothing at first, and that silence cut deeper than shouting, because it forced people to notice him, to notice the way he placed himself directly between the boy and the farmer's fist without asking permission. The boy looked up at him, startled, because no one ever stepped in, and for a moment the word thief loosened its grip, replaced by something unfamiliar and dangerous, the feeling that someone saw him as worth standing in front of, even if it meant standing alone. The silence the warrior brought with him did not last, because crowds do not like to be interrupted once they have chosen a story, and the word thief was repeated again, louder this time, as if saying it often enough could push the man aside, and the boy felt it slam back into him with doubled force. Someone laughed and said the Indian was defending his own kind, even though the boy was nothing like him, and that lie found quick footing, because it gave the crowd a reason to turn fear into something sharper. The farmer tightened his grip on the boy's collar, jerking him forward so his feet scraped the dirt, and demanded again to know where the rest of the stolen goods were. And when the boy shook his head, the farmer shook him too, hard enough to make his teeth click, because anger likes motion. The warrior spoke then, his voice low but carrying, asking the man to release the child, and though the words were calm, they landed heavy, because they were not a request. The farmer scoffed and said this was town business, that outsiders did not decide what happened here, and the crowd murmured approval, because drawing lines made them feel protected. The boy's chest burned as he struggled to breathe, his hands curling into fists he did not know how to use, and he wondered if stepping out from behind the warrior would make things easier for him, because that was what he had always done before, taken the blame quickly so the hurting would end sooner. The sheriff arrived then, riding in at a slow trot that suggested he already knew how this would go, his badge catching the sun, his eyes moving not to the boy first but to the warrior, because authority always noticed resistance before truth. He asked what the trouble was, and half a dozen voices answered at once, each version growing darker, louder, until the apple became a sack. The sack became weeks of theft, and the boy became a problem that needed solving. The sheriff listened with the patience of a man who liked being needed, nodding along, and when he finally raised his hand for quiet, he said the word thief himself, carefully, as if placing a stamp, and that single word from a man with a badge settled over the crowd like permission. The warrior did not move. He asked the sheriff what proof there was, and the question rippled uneasily, because proof required slowing down, and no one wanted to slow down anymore. The sheriff pointed to the apple, to the boy's thin frame, to the crowd itself, saying that when enough people saw the same thing, it became truth, and the boy felt something collapse inside him because he had learned that hunger always looked like guilt from a full stomach. The warrior stepped closer to the boy, close enough that the man holding him had to loosen his grip, and said that a town that taught its children to steal fear instead of mercy would not like what it grew into. That drew laughter and anger in equal measure, and someone shouted that the Indian was threatening them, that he should mind his place, and the sheriff's jaw tightened, because now the crowd had found a new enemy. As voices rose and the rope was lifted higher, the boy understood that the word thief was no longer just about him. It was a spark, and sparks needed only one shove to become fire. The rope swayed once in the farmer's hand, not tied yet, but heavy with suggestion, and the boy's eyes followed it with the dull focus of someone who had learned too early how endings looked, while the warrior remained exactly where he was, feet planted, shoulders squared, as if the ground itself had decided to hold. The sheriff noticed that stillness and frowned, because men who did not step back when asked were problems that required examples, and he told the warrior to move aside, his tone patient in the way that warned patience was almost gone. The warrior answered that the boy was a child, not a thief, and that hunger was not a crime, and though his voice never rose, it carried far enough that even those at the edge of the crowd heard it and shifted uncomfortably. The farmer laughed and said that if the warrior cared so much he could take the boy with him, but the sheriff shook his head, saying no one left town under accusation, and the crowd murmured approval, because keeping someone contained felt like control. The boy felt his knees weaken and leaned back without meaning to, and the warrior's hand came out, steadying him with a touch so firm and certain that the boy's breath caught, because no one had ever held him like that without expecting something in return. The sheriff stepped closer, his shadow falling across the boy, and said that obstruction of law was a serious offense, especially from an Indian who already strained the town's tolerance, and that word tolerance landed like an insult dressed as generosity. The warrior did not flinch. He said the law should not need a rope to explain itself, and that sentence cut deeper than any threat, because it named what everyone could see. A stone clattered to the ground near their feet, thrown from somewhere behind, and then another struck the dirt by the boy's heel, and the crowd surged with the sudden confidence that came when no one was singled out for blame. The boy squeezed his eyes shut, expecting pain, but it did not come, because the warrior shifted again, placing his body between the stones and the child, and the impact thudded harmlessly against his back. The sheriff shouted for order, but his voice was swallowed by the noise he had allowed to grow, and in that chaos the boy realized something strange, that the warrior was not fighting the crowd at all. He was refusing to participate in it. A deputy moved in, reaching for the boy's arm, and the warrior caught his wrist mid-air, not violently, just enough to stop it, and the contact sent a hush rippling outward, because restraint was harder to argue with than force. The sheriff's face darkened, and he reached for his sidearm, not drawing it yet but letting the threat hang, and said this was the last chance, that the warrior would step aside or be arrested, and the boy felt the familiar urge to surrender, to make himself small so someone else would not be hurt. He opened his mouth to say he would go, but before the words could escape, the warrior spoke his own, saying no, simply no, and in that refusal, the boy felt a wall rise where there had never been one before, a boundary drawn not with fists or ropes, but with the quiet certainty that some things could not be crossed. The sheriff took the warrior's refusal as a challenge meant for him alone, and his hand moved from warning to action with the practiced ease of a man who had learned that force often ended arguments faster than truth, and he ordered the deputies forward, saying the boy would be taken into custody immediately for his own good, because those words had always covered whatever came next. The crowd leaned in, hungry now, not for justice but for resolution, and the boy felt the pressure of bodies behind him like a wall closing, his breath shallow, his eyes fixed on the warrior's back as if it were the only solid thing left. A deputy grabbed for the boy's arm again, harder this time, fingers digging in, and before the boy could cry out, the warrior shifted, knocking the hand away with a sharp, controlled motion that drew a gasp from the crowd. Because it crossed the invisible line between watching and doing. The sheriff shouted that the warrior was resisting arrest, and just like that, the story changed. No longer about a stolen apple, but about a dangerous Indian defying the law, and the boy realized with a sick clarity how quickly blame could be redirected when it served power. A fist flew from the side, catching the warrior's jaw with a dull crack, and the boy screamed, because the sound of it tore through him. But the warrior did not fall, only staggered, planting his feet again as blood traced a thin line from his mouth. The crowd roared, emboldened by contact, and another blow came, then another, boots scraping, voices shouting, and the sheriff did nothing to stop it, because violence was doing his work for him. The boy crouched instinctively, arms over his head. But the warrior bent, shielding him, taking the hits meant for smaller bones, and the boy felt each impact like it landed inside his own chest. Someone yelled that the Indian had it coming, that order had to be taught, and the sheriff finally stepped in, not to halt the beating, but to strike with his baton, driving it into the warrior's ribs, and the sound of that blow carried a finality that made even the crowd hesitate. The warrior dropped to one knee, breath knocked from him, but his hand stayed firm on the boy's shoulder, anchoring him, telling him without words to stay, to live, to see this through. The boy tasted blood in his own mouth from biting down too hard, and through the ringing in his ears he understood something he had never been taught, that law could wear a badge and still swing like a fist, and that standing between right and wrong sometimes meant being broken in public. As the sheriff raised the baton again, the boy looked out at the faces around them, searching for one that would stop it. And for the first time he saw doubt flicker there, thin but real, because even a crowd could only watch a man be beaten for so long before the lie holding them together began to crack. The blow that should have fallen next never did, because the sound of it was replaced by something softer and far more dangerous to the lie holding the crowd together, the sound of a woman crying out that it was enough, followed by another voice, then another, until the noise of anger thinned into confused murmurs. The warrior stayed on one knee, breathing hard, blood darkening his sleeve, and the boy remained pressed against him, fingers locked into the cloth as if letting go would make everything collapse again, and for a moment no one moved, as though the ground itself were asking them to look at what they had become. The sheriff lowered his baton slowly, eyes scanning the crowd, because the certainty he relied on had begun to slip, and certainty was the only thing that kept men like him standing tall. A farmer shifted his feet and said he had only seen the boy take an apple, nothing more, and that the beating had gone too far, and his words landed heavily, because they were ordinary, unheroic, and therefore hard to dismiss. Another man said he had once been hungry too, that he remembered stealing turnips as a boy and being forgiven for it, and suddenly the story the town had been telling itself no longer fit the faces in front of it. The boy listened, stunned, because adults were speaking truths he had never been allowed to hear, and each one felt like a small stone placed against the rope that had nearly closed around his life. The sheriff snapped that order had to be maintained, that discipline mattered, but his voice no longer commanded the space, and the warrior lifted his head enough to meet the crowd's eyes, saying quietly that the earth remembered every injustice laid upon it, that towns built on cruelty always felt it return. And though some scoffed, others looked down at their boots as if afraid the ground might answer. The boy felt the warrior's hand squeeze his shoulder once, reassuring, and that simple gesture steadied him more than words ever had. A deputy helped the warrior to his feet without being told, and the sheriff noticed, because loyalty slipping was more frightening than any accusation. As the warrior stood, unsteady but upright, the crowd parted just enough to give him space, not out of fear now, but out of something closer to respect. And the boy realized that what had changed was not the law or the charge, but the way people were seeing, because once a beating was witnessed for what it was, it could no longer be mistaken for justice. The sheriff backed away a step, recalculating, and in that small retreat the boy sensed the shift, the moment when the ground beneath them all remembered the truth, louder than the town's lie ever had. Blood darkened the dust at the warrior's feet. a thin, undeniable line that pulled the crowd's attention downward, because it is harder to argue with what stains the ground than with what lives in the mouth, and the boy stared at it with a hollow calm that frightened him more than panic ever had. The sheriff saw the looks changing and moved quickly to reclaim the moment, ordering the deputies to finish it and take both of them in, because when control begins to slip, force feels like the only answer left. A deputy stepped forward, then hesitated, eyes flicking from the blood to the boy's face, and that hesitation rippled, small but contagious, because once one man paused, others remembered they could too. The warrior straightened despite the pain, placing himself fully in front of the boy again, and though his breath came short, his voice did not waver as he said there would be no more hands on the child, not today, not ever, and the certainty of it cut through the noise like a blade through cloth. The sheriff barked that the town would not be lectured by an outsider, that the boy belonged to the law now. But someone in the crowd shouted back that the law had already taken enough, and the sound of that defiance startled even the speaker. The boy felt the warrior's elbow brush his arm, steady and protective, and he realized that blood had changed the rules, because it had made the cost visible, and visible costs invite questions no one wants to answer. A woman pushed through the line, kneeling to dab at the warrior's wound with her handkerchief, and the sheriff snapped at her to get back, but she did not, because tending a wound is a language older than authority. Murmurs spread, some angry, some ashamed, and the sheriff sensed the moment tipping, so he reached for the boy himself, fingers stretching out like a claim, and the warrior moved faster than pain should have allowed, knocking the hand aside and planting his feet, drawing a clear boundary with his body. The crowd gasped, not at the contact but at the refusal, because refusal had become contagious too. The boy's heart pounded as he watched men who had shouted moments before now look away, and he understood that once blood is spilled for mercy, it is no longer easy to argue for cruelty without seeing yourself. The sheriff looked around and found fewer allies than he expected, his voice rising as he threatened consequences, but the words fell flat against the quiet forming in the space between people. In that quiet, the boy felt something solid settle inside him, the knowledge that the line had been drawn not by law or rope, but by a man willing to bleed in public so a child would not have to. The quiet that followed was not peace, but strain, the kind that comes just before something gives way, and the boy felt it humming through the crowd like a wire pulled too tight, because fear does not vanish all at once, it fractures, splinter by splinter. The sheriff sensed it too, and tried to tighten his grip with words, warning that defiance would be remembered, that names would be written down, and consequences would follow, but his threats no longer landed with the weight they once carried, because they sounded like echoes of a moment already passing. A man near the edge of the crowd cleared his throat and said he had only come to watch, not to see someone beaten, and another added that the boy looked no older than his own son, and those small admissions spread uneasily, giving others permission to step back, to lower their eyes, to put space between themselves and what had almost been done. The warrior stood firm despite the blood on his sleeve, and the boy stayed close, feeling the steadiness of him like a post in deep earth, and together they faced the people who had wanted an ending that would not stain their hands. Someone muttered that it was going too far, that it had always gone too far, and the sheriff turned on the speaker, furious, because fear is only useful when it points outward, never inward. The boy watched faces change, watched anger lose its sharpness and become something like embarrassment, and that shift unsettled him more than shouting ever had, because it meant the crowd was starting to see him. A woman stepped forward and said the apple had been bruised anyway, that it would have been thrown out by nightfall. And her voice trembled as she spoke, because she understood what she was admitting, that a child had nearly been destroyed for something that did not matter. The sheriff tried once more to command them, but the words slipped off unanswered, and he found himself alone in the space he had once ruled, surrounded by people who no longer needed him to decide what was right. The warrior spoke then, quietly, telling them that fear asked for obedience, but mercy asked for courage, and that courage was harder because it required seeing each other clearly. The boy listened, heart racing, and felt the last tight knot inside him begin to loosen, because the crowd was no longer pressing inward, It was opening, creating a fragile path where there had been none. As people stepped aside, some ashamed, some relieved, the boy realized that fear had broken not with a shout, but with a refusal to keep pretending. And that moment, small and uncelebrated, was the first true victory he had ever known. The space that opened in the crowd did not feel like forgiveness yet, only like uncertainty. And uncertainty made people dangerous in a different way, because it forced them to look for something else to hold on to. The sheriff sensed that weakness and stepped forward quickly, raising his voice to reclaim the moment, declaring that the boy was not on trial for hunger, but for theft, that rules had to mean something, and that letting him go would invite chaos into a town already stretched thin. The boy felt the old fear stir again, because he had heard this before, the way grown men dressed cruelty in careful words, and he tightened his grip on the warrior's sleeve as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. Before the sheriff could continue, a woman pushed through the thinning line of bodies, her face pale but set, and said she was the one whose apple had been taken, that it had fallen from her crate when she turned away, and that the boy had not grabbed it from her hand as the story claimed. Her voice shook as she spoke, because truth spoken late always carries regret with it. And a murmur rolled through the crowd as others began piecing together what they had seen, rather than what they had been told. A farmer admitted he had shouted thief without knowing why, only because someone else had said it first, and another said the boy had been hanging around town for days, thin as a fence rail, never bothering anyone. And with each confession, the lie began to sag under its own weight. The sheriff tried to interrupt, accusing them of being fooled by sympathy, but his words tangled now, no longer clean or commanding, because sympathy was exactly what had been missing. The warrior straightened slightly, pain still etched across his face, and said quietly that lies survived only when everyone agreed to carry them, and that today too many hands had let go. The boy listened, stunned, because adults were admitting fault openly, and he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, a cautious hope that did not feel foolish yet. The sheriff looked around and realized the crowd was no longer behind him, that the rope lay forgotten in the dirt, and that his badge could not force belief where doubt had already taken root. He muttered that the council would hear of this, that consequences would follow, but his threat drifted unanswered because the people were watching the boy now, really watching him, seeing the dirt on his knees and the fear he had tried so hard to swallow. The woman who had spoken first stepped closer and held out a clean apple from her basket, not as payment, but as apology. And when the boy hesitated, the warrior nodded once and he took it, feeling the weight of that small gesture more than the bruises on his arms. In that moment the lie finally collapsed, not with anger or force, but with ordinary people choosing truth over comfort. And the boy understood that the label they had given him could be taken away just as easily as it had been placed, if enough people were willing to see him clearly. No one cheered when the sheriff stepped back, because there was nothing to celebrate in how close the town had come to breaking itself, and the boy felt the strange quiet settle like dust after a collapse, heavy with what might have been. The sheriff cleared his throat and tried to speak of procedure, of councils and records and consequences, but his words no longer arranged the space the way they once had, because authority sounds different after it has been questioned aloud. A man near the storefront said the charge should be dropped, plain and simple, and another added that the beating had gone too far to pretend this was about an apple anymore, and the crowd nodded, not in triumph but in tired agreement, as if they were all waking from the same uneasy dream. The warrior stood with his arm braced against a post, blood dried dark on his sleeve, and he did not ask for apology or thanks, only looked at the people as if measuring whether they would remember this when it mattered again. The boy stayed close, feeling both exposed and steadied, because being seen without being seized was a new experience, and he did not yet trust it to last. The sheriff tried once more to gather his deputies, but one of them shook his head and said enough, that no law required a child to be frightened half to death to make a point, and that refusal landed harder than any shout, because it came from within the badge itself. A vote was called, rough and imperfect, hands rising without enthusiasm, and when the count was clear, the charge was dismissed, not with speeches or ceremony, but with a muttered acknowledgement that there was no case left to stand on. The boy felt a tightness in his chest loosen, slow and cautious, because relief learned from pain does not arrive all at once. Someone kicked the rope aside, sending it skidding into the dust, and the sound of it scraping away felt like a door closing on a room the boy never wanted to enter again. The sheriff removed his hat, not in respect but in resignation, and said the town would speak of this later, but the later he promised sounded small compared to the now unfolding in front of him. The woman who had offered the apple earlier returned with a loaf, breaking it cleanly and handing the boy a piece, and this time he took it without looking away, because shame had lost its grip. The warrior inclined his head slightly, accepting the outcome without satisfaction, and told the crowd that judgment without cheers was the only kind worth trusting, because it meant no one was trying to feel better than they deserved. As people drifted back to their days, quieter than before, the boy realized that justice did not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrived like this, unspectacular and hard-won, leaving behind a silence that asked everyone to remember what they had almost done. The crowd thinned without ceremony, people returning to their errands with slower steps, as if the ground itself had changed beneath them, and the boy stood in the middle of the street feeling lighter and more uncertain at the same time, because the word that had followed him for so long was suddenly gone, and he did not yet know how to walk without it. The warrior rested against the post, breathing carefully, the pain in his ribs written plainly on his face, and the boy turned toward him instinctively, because when the noise faded, it was the man who had remained. He asked in a small voice if it was truly over, and the warrior answered that nothing was ever truly over, but that today had been enough, and sometimes enough was all a person could ask for. A shopkeeper swept up the crushed apple and the dirt around it, erasing the last sign of the beginning, and the boy watched the motion with quiet focus, understanding that small acts mattered more than grand words when it came to endings. The woman who had brought the loaf earlier returned again, pressing it into his hands without apology or explanation, and he accepted it with a nod because he had learned that receiving without shame was its own kind of courage. The sheriff had already gone, his absence leaving behind an emptiness that felt less threatening than his presence ever had, and the deputies dispersed without orders, avoiding the warrior's eyes because there were some debts they were not ready to name. The boy sat on the edge of the boardwalk and ate slowly, feeling strength return with each bite, and for the first time he did not feel the need to rush, because no one was counting his steps or measuring his worth. The warrior joined him after a moment, lowering himself with care, and told the boy that labels were tools used by those who did not want to see clearly, that once a person accepted them, they became hard to remove, but that today the boy had seen how easily they could also be refused. The boy listened, turning those words over as if they were something solid he could keep, and he asked what would happen next, because next had always been the most frightening part. The warrior said he would leave town by morning, that he did not belong in places where men used ropes to think, and the boy felt a sudden ache at the thought of being left again, sharp and familiar. The warrior looked at him closely then and asked where he would go, and the boy realized he did not know, that he had always been moving away from something rather than toward it. The warrior nodded, not unkindly, and said that a path could be chosen instead of fled, that names and directions were things a person could decide for themselves if given the chance. As the sun dipped lower and the street settled into a quieter rhythm, the boy stood and brushed the dust from his clothes, feeling something inside him steady at last, because for the first time he was not walking as a thief or a burden or a problem, but simply as a boy, unmarked and still becoming, and that freedom, fragile and new, felt like the beginning of a life he might finally be allowed to keep. The town never planned to become cruel. It only planned to be certain. But certainty built on fear always needs a victim. And that day it chose a child because he was small enough to carry the blame. What stopped it was not law, not authority, and not the crowd turning kind all at once. It was one man who refused to step aside when cruelty asked politely. Redemption does not arrive with applause. It arrives when someone stands still while everyone else pushes forward. And sometimes that's enough to let a boy walk away without a label, and a town remember what it almost became.